As you all know, I uploaded a video on Prydwen's tier list the other day. It got a little bit crazy, so I decided to make my own to help answer a lot of the questions that people are having in the comments. And I did that with some help from my community. I recognize that I'm bringing some hot takes when it comes to the tier list, but I have a reason for all of them. Enjoy. When it comes to the tier list in Wuthering Waves, it's a little bit complex because this game has a lot more nuance, a lot more intricacies in it in the stuff that you're actually doing on field. So, WoWA isn't really like other gacha games, because you're coming in to WoWA, you have a 3-person team. That means all of your buffs, right, relative to other games, all the stuff that you're doing, there are less people that can make an impact, right, in your gameplay. You don't have 3 extra teammates to go with your hypercarry or DPS. You're only going to have 2. And that makes, like, the sub-DPS, the buffer role, the hybrid role as it is on Prydwen, a lot more important for your team's success. Think about a lot of other gacha games, right? When you have your main DPS, your hypercarry, you have 2 other teammates oftentimes that are helping to support them. So that means the strength of a team, right, is consolidated into less characters. Second is that investment in WoWA really matters. And that's from the perspective of, do you have a crit rate weapon? Are you hyper optimizing or not hyper optimizing your echoes? Are you kind of going in with like 60, 240 versus like, 75, 270? What are you going in with when it comes to your investment on the echo side? And what are you getting out? What that means is when you have differing levels of investment, it is super important in a game like this, because that can be the difference between a longer rotation that's letting you clear in 2 or shorter rotations where you have to clear with 3. And that has a big impact on your time. Then you have all of that differentiation, right, between your 2-minute clears, your 1-minute clears, and your speedrunners. Different characters are a lot better and a lot more viable depending on how fast you're clearing and how well invested they're in. And some characters scale a lot better than others. And third, player skill is way too normalized, and there's too much of an expectation put on a certain floor player's skill that's in the current tier list. And that's why one tier list isn't enough. You're going to want multiple to account for those differences in investment and those differences in skill. I'm pretty sure if we looked at correlation versus causation, people with less investment in their characters are probably typically going to be worse at the game. And so that means those characters like Chang Li, your Calcharo, I guess your Encore, it's just not going to be as good in their hands, right? And we don't want somebody that's playing on mobile and really isn't that good to look at Chang Li, right, in tier 0 and be like, oh, it's a tier 0 character, I should pick him up and learn him. Or they don't have the expert tag, right? They pick up Chang Li and they're like, what am I doing? How do I play this character? Why are they doing less damage than everybody else that's ranked below them? That's because they can't play them, or they don't have the right level of investment. And that to me is like, okay, we're not factoring in that floor level into there. So with that was our quick and short and sweet little overview. Let's get on into the tier list. What you're gonna notice is that I'm gonna have multiple tier lists, and obviously you're gonna see in S what that tier list is actually for. That just means that I'm gonna be having multiple roles, and we're not gonna be using all of the different characters that we're seeing down here. The way that we're gonna be going through it is, first, we're gonna be having our sustainers as kind of the backbone of every single team, because in most cases and in most situations, you do want one of these characters. Second, we're gonna have the sub-DPS category, and I'm just turning this into a sub-DPS or outro skill category. And what that means is that any character that has an outro skill provides some benefit to the team, but is a little bit more singular and less general. That means that they're probably gonna go into this category. So we might be seeing a bit of Chang Li here. And then next, we're gonna have our raw DPS category. Then we're gonna be getting into what I like to call the high investment DPS category. And then for our last category, we're going to be doing dual DPS. And then we'll get into some of the speedrun findings. I actually have gotten in touch with a couple of people on the CN side that have given me their interpretation of a tier list based off of, them clearing Tower of Adversity level 100 enemies in like 29 to 30 seconds. So we can get a short preview of that. I don't think we're going to be going in it super in depth, but you guys can get like a bit of an overview of what the meta looks like from that perspective, what it looks like at the very peak of Wuthering Waves gameplay. We can also look at some videos of it. It does not look like peak Wuthering Waves gameplay. It looks like you're playing a completely different game. So just we'll keep that as like a bit of a treat until the end. All 4 stars are expected to be S6. The first list that we will be starting on is also going to be the shortest one, and that's going to be the sustainers. We're going to be getting through this, I think, relatively quickly and discuss if Yang Yang really does belong in the sustainer category. I know like somebody went into my comments on that Prydwen video and they were like, well, when we're defining support, we're talking about people that can just support the team or increase damage or like provide energy. You know, by that definition, right? Yang is, or Jeja is a support, right? Because she has the same exact energy granting skill on her inherent. So Jeja grants energy on her inherent, so is she a support? You know, that whole definition to me is like a little bit wonky. So I'm just gonna be like, I don't know about that, boss. So to me, a sustainer in Wuthering Waves is somebody that prevents you from getting wiped. You can make mistakes and it will help you undo those mistakes. So by that definition, I am going to be putting in the support category these characters. Let's start off with Spectral Rover though, because Spectral Rover, my friends, is a healer. They are a sustainer. And the fact that they're not recognized as one, you know, when they stop time and prevent enemies from attacking and heal on their liberation, to me is a little bit weird. Because I think they fit the bill of definition of a support to a T. So understanding that. Spectral Rover goes in B for sustain for me. The real reason for that is they are a very utility focused character who doesn't provide a lot of damage boosts to the whole team. When they're slotted in on Rejuvenating Glow, they get the job done. They have way better animations, way better playstyle than a lot of other supports on this list. For me is in B because they don't have the right team yet. What I mean by them not having the right team is that they, in a lot of ways, could be considered a good team for Jinxie. Just from the perspective that they can reduce Spectral Res, they can buff her damage, or they can stop time and let her get off her combos a little bit easier, and they reduce the Spectral resistance. But they don't provide coordinated attacks. And that to me is the main reason why Spectral Rover just isn't at their full potential yet. They need a Spectral DPS that doesn't rely on coordinated attacks. And then suddenly they become a much more appealing sustainer option. Because you can focus more on their Spectral resistance reduction versus like the outro skill buffs you see on other sustainers where you get like 15% attribute damage boost. So B tier for me, at least when it comes to the sustainers, are characters that have the potential, but not the team yet. It's not that their kits are bad, it's that their kits haven't realized everything that they can do in actual gameplay, because there just isn't the roster for them. And that's also the reason why I am going to be putting Yohu and Baizha in the B tier. I would make these the rankings in the tier. Baizha, then Yohu, then Spectral Rover. But I would say they're all relatively close because they all need different pieces of the pie to be complete. Baizha has an insane amount of potential. The reason why Baizha has an insane amount of potential is, I'm gonna pop into the game for a quick second so you guys can have a relevant overview of her sequence notes. All right, cool. So Baizha sequence notes. S6, when you pick up Baizha's feather, right? The one that gives the 15% attack boost to the team. All of your teammates, all of them on the team, gain a 12% glacial damage boost. In retrospect, right? When you factor this in with a comparison to, let's just say, Verena, Baizha will be a better buffer for glacial teams than Verena. But the problem is, the only team that fully uses this power is one with Ling Yang. This is really distracting. Yeah, they need to fix this. They need to fix whatever's going on here. Why is this happening? It's doomed. What this means is that Carlotta, we know Carlotta's Glacial. If Carlotta isn't Glacial, there's a serious problem with Kuro Games' character design. When Carlotta releases as a Glacial, hopefully main DPS, that shoots, you know, her ice musket, right? And Jeja, hopefully, is her best in slot sub DPS. Obviously, we cannot prematurely recognize Baizha's strength because Carlotta isn't out yet. Because there hasn't been a limited Glacial DPS. And so once that happens, we're good to go. Then we're gonna have Yohu. One thing you're gonna notice about this character, right, is that they heal. Then you look at their sequence nodes and you're like, wait, do they actually heal? Crit damage, 4 time, 4 stacks, 15%. Crit rate, 15% for 14 seconds. RNG gambling, attack buffs, damage bonus doubling, and more RNG. Half of me is convinced that this character is meant to be a joke, where you just like literally roll the dice and then random shit happens on field. But the other half is her clear intentional design as an on-fielder. For somebody that delivers coordinated attacks that deal a shit ton of damage. But the main issue here, right, is that when it comes to the coordinated attackers on the roster, they don't buff her main form of damage, which is her basic attacks. There is no coordinated attacker who buffs basic attacks. And what that means is that this outro buff can only go to characters like Jeja, or Yinlin, or Mortifi, and actually have an impact, but none of them buff her main damage type. So what that means is that this character, you can't leverage anything in their kit currently with the current roster, unless you're willing to like grief one buff or another. And that makes the end result just very disappointing for every single team that she's in. Let's use C as the category for when a character isn't reaching their full potential. And let's use D for a completely unsalvageable, broken kit that just doesn't work very well. Let's do that instead. And because of that, I'm going to be putting Baizha in B to more clearly differentiate that even without Glacio teams, she is more viable than these two in the meta. Baizha can become S with Glacio teams, hopefully if Carlotta is Glacio, once Carlotta releases, right? She might be at bottom of S, potentially, or the highest of A, but for right now, she's B. These two, on the other hand, they might jump up to B or A, depending on whether or not the teammates come out that work with them. Now, with that, it's time to address the elephant in the room, and that is the ranking for Tao Chi. This character is complicated, because if we're thinking about the role, right, of a raw sustainer, somebody that will keep your team alive and give you some additional buffs on the side, Tao Chi might technically be the best sustainer in the game, because when she is fully built, your team is effectively invincible. You can use Tao Chi, especially in content like holograms, and she is a cheat code. If it's highly damaging bosses that maybe don't have as much health or your time limit does not matter, Tao Chi is an S tier character. If you're a god gamer, Tao Chi is probably in D or bottom of C, if I'm being frankly entirely honest. That's just how it is. Because she provides strength and she provides utility that you don't need. In a game like this, you can always use more damage. More damage is always acceptable. There's not a cap on damage. In this game, there is a cap on healing. There is a cap on sustain. And that cap gets lower or higher, depending on how bad you are at the game. If you're somebody that is struggling with the game, she's going to do a really, really good job for you. And alternatively, if you're not somebody who struggles with the game, if you're very good at dodging, if you don't have any problems on hologram bosses, she's not going to be that great. But she is one of the only characters that will tank hologram boss hits. Ranter619 said it really good. A 10% heal, like you'll get from Shorekeeper or Verena, right? They don't actually heal that much. 10% heal won't save you when a boss hits you once for 85% of your HP. If you get hit twice, your run is over. You have to restart, re-clear. I guess based off of that discussion, and I guess to avoid any more controversy regarding this character, let's put her at top of C for now. Jianshin is a sustainer because she will heal, she will shield, and she groups at the same time, but she has some kind of annoying field time requirements. They're a little bit annoying. They're not the best, but this is where the whole idea of rotations come in. If you're a lower skilled player who doesn't have the crispiest rotations, who kind of takes a while to get through the stuff, you get hit a couple of times, and you don't do everything that well, Jianshin will actually be pretty good because her increased time in her rotation isn't really going to hurt somebody that's making a ton of mistakes in the first place. And she gives some pretty fat buffs. She also counters. You can literally hold it, you can get hit, and then she'll block an attack. She's got some interesting stuff. She's got one of the better buffs in the game, and her shield is at high level. It's massive. I do think she is more useful than these three because of the fact that she has built-in grouping. She's more useful than these three, but her buffs aren't as universal. I'll do a bit of a quick explanation between these two and why I do believe that they are in similar spots, because we might as well talk about the difference between Shorekeeper and Verena. These two characters are the best in-slot sustainers. They have some of the best concerto generation across sustainers, and they have the best buffs across sustainers. The only thing is that both of them have different strengths that make them excel on different team comps. The difference between these two isn't necessarily their power level, it's the teams that they support. Because Shorekeeper is a lot better for some teams, while Verena is better for others. Verena has coordinated attacks, Shorekeeper doesn't. Let's do a bit of like a delineation between the two. So, Shorekeeper is the best in slot hyper carry sustainer. And hyper carry teams are a lot easier to play. And what that means is that dual DPS is where Verena has a lot more potential. Shorekeeper's buffs are undoubtedly better. If you are lower investment, this is the new tier list. If you are lower investment, Shorekeeper is genuinely better than Verena. Once we get to turbo investment, right? I'm talking like you're hitting like 300% crit damage, you're going into the tower and you're speed running in 30 seconds. These are the new rankings. This is when Verena's much faster rotation time and much faster access to buffs is what is allowing her to kind of claim that top spot. That is what our final tier list is going to be looking like for our sustainers. I guess we'll just put Yanwu on here because somebody mentioned him. But if you're using him as a sustainer with two other characters on your team that are a sub-DPS and a DPS, this is gonna suck. You're probably gonna get wiped. He's more of a sub-DPS with defensive potential. So, we're looking pretty good on this. Let's move on to what's probably going to be the most controversial category on this list. And that, my friends, is the hybrid sub-DPS outro. And one thing you're going to notice across these tier lists is that I'm not going to be afraid to put people in multiple categories. Because, like I mentioned in my previous Prydwen vid, right? One of the beautiful things about this game is the potential to mix and match. And so right here at the bottom, right before we start actually ranking things, this is my list of all of the actual potential sub-DPS characters in this game. Going by the definition that they either have some buffing capability or their outro skill directly does the buffing. And the difference is between this category and sustainers is the fact that sustainers quite literally have things built into their kit that keeps your team alive. And that's the selling point of a sustainer. While a buffer focuses less on the keeping alive piece and more on the buffing. And obviously, there's going to be a character like John Shin in here that is a little bit more confusing. So, the characters that I would put at the bottom of the list when it comes to sub-DPS is through the sheer fact that they have something lacking, either on the buffing end or on the damage end compared to pretty much every single other character on the list. And after having had the time to experiment and actually use some of these characters in content, there are a lot of options that I feel like haven't gotten their time in the sun. And let's do remember that one of the big things about my tier list and how I'm going to be judging these characters is how they compare to other options. There really aren't that many characters in the sub-DPS category that actually belong in something like D or C. And so with that, I'm going to be putting Spectral Rover as a sub-DPS, as an outro buffer. I'm actually going to be the first person that puts them in C. This is based off of the fact that I believe that their skill set and the things that they bring to the table are far more focused on actually keeping your team alive and far less focused on buffing damage. It's good for keeping your team alive. And their overall damage contribution isn't high enough to warrant them having no buffing capability. The only other attribute that they can buff is Spectro. Who else is Spectro in this game? We have one DPS character that does it, and the rest are supports who don't really do damage. So, the next category that we're going to be looking at now is B, and when it comes to here, B characters are going to be ones that don't necessarily have ability to deal damage and your ability to buff. And that's why one of the first characters that I'm going to be putting in here is, crazily enough, Chisha. Because Chisha has a decent amount of damage that she actually brings to the table. She has a buff on her S6. When you use like that final shot in her resonance skill, which is kind of like what you end your rotations with, you buff all of your teammates' basic attack damage by 25%. Decent buff, obviously not as good as Sanhwa's, but Chisha's personal damage is higher than Sanhwa's. But her concerto efficiency, right, isn't as good. She doesn't get these buffs as fast. And the end result is that you don't get a lot of mileage out of her. And she has a lot of specificity in how she works. So we're putting her in B because she's not really meant to be here. She has one of the best damages out of all the sub-DPSs. But at the end of the day, that buffing capability is where she kind of has some downsides. Next up, in the sub-DPS category, I am going to be putting in Yanwu. The reason why I'm putting Yanwu in B is because he sort of does damage. He sort of does. It's not like his damage is non-existent. It's very consistent and it's very easy to land. And he provides utility in a way that is a little bit understated. Breaking vibration strength faster is really, really good because that means you're going to break the enemy faster, right? And breaking the enemy means that they're in their broken state and they're going to be much more exposed to damage and take a lot more. And having that come up more often, especially against certain enemies, right, that are a little annoying when they're in the air, is a huge benefit and a huge thing that you should keep in mind. Then he also has coordinated attacks, which are, you know, a little bit specific for certain characters, specifically Jinsei, and, you know, in a sense, Yohu, right? That synergy that you also have to factor in. Yanwu has the downside of, like, really kind of dog shit concerto energy, at least in my opinion. His first rotation is always, like, it takes forever to get a full meter, and as a result, it's just like, you don't have that same level of fluidity that you feel like you have with other characters. And that to me is why he's in B tier, is that he has a lot of good stuff in his kit that actually really helps you a lot, but his concerto efficiency just feels so bad and unwieldy that to a degree, it almost feels like you should have the concerto weapon on him for him to be usable. But then you're sacrificing his damage, right? Because you could put the defense gauntlets on him. So I think bottom of, you know, potentially you could swap these two around. It works, right? I will say though, he might be the slowest sub DPS in the game. So we'll keep him in B for now, just, you know, thinking about it in terms of, like, average rankings across skill levels, and move on from there. I don't want to put any more characters in the B category. You know what that means, right? It's A for Alto. I have played this character, and I have gotten better clears with my Gion team. I got a 40-something second clear on Scar with Alto, and it took longer for me to do it with Mortefi. He's actually good. His taunt quite literally will draw the aggro of the boss, and it will do the equivalent of grouping. Why do you do grouping? You do grouping because you want the enemies to be easier to hit so you can deal damage to all of them, right? Alto will CC a boss. A taunt is a CC. Alto has the only CC in the game that works on boss enemies, and he will cause them to miss all of their attacks. They will stay in one spot. They'll, like, turn around, right, in the tower to go face the other direction that you came from. And then you can just wail on them with your DPS from behind. And the end result is just one of the most complete characters from the perspective of he boosts my damage by removing RNG from the boss's moveset. He provides pretty decent buffs. His 23% arrow damage is great for Gion. He generates Concerto incredibly fast when he's at high sequence nodes. Next up in A tier, we're going to be putting Yang Yang a little bit above Alto. Reasons for that is because this character, with setup, you do her heavy attack and skill before you intro in on her. If you do Yang Yang's heavy attack and her skill before you activate her intro, she has quite literally one of the most disgustingly fast concerto rotations in the game. She will intro in off of your sustainer, come in through the air, you're going to use her enhanced attack, directly come to the ground, and then liberation and your full concerto. That is the character's rotation. You spend 1 second on it prior to her intro skill, you intro skill, and then the rest of her concerto is completely free. And the other thing is, guys, this is at S6 as well, right? The reason why Alto's at the bottom of A is because he doesn't have buffs that are as good as Yang Yang's. At least on the sequence node side. Yang Yang at S6 grants a 20% attack boost to the entire team after you use her air attack. And, I'm going to be honest, she has one of the most smooth and fun playstyles in the game. I really love her things with Zhang Liao because Yang Yang's outro skill doesn't expire on swap. You can play quick swap with her on the Zhang Liao team. She becomes like the hyper carry enabling quick swapper. And that to me is such a unique role that works well. And I'm telling you guys, This is the Chang, or the, Chang Li's cool too. But Zhongli, Yao, and Yang Yang, I'm going to be honest, it is a banger team. All right, next up, I'm going to get some pretty easy ones. So we're going to be just putting Zhang Xin also in A. Because when you dedicate the field time to her, you can get a pretty good amount of Concerto really fast, right? Doing her full charge is crazy Concerto energy generation. And if you're playing her as a sub DPS whose goal is buffing, her damage is pretty decent too. She does a decent amount. And the end result is that this character is similar to Yang Yang in that they combine grouping, but they have a much more damaging buff, and they don't really have like quick swap potential. They require a bit more field time, but once everything's put together and you're using her on a team that benefits heavily from Resonance Liberation, she works out really well. And if you want to help her Concerto, you can always use like the Concerto generating weapon. But in my opinion, when you build Zhang Xin to deal damage, it works. And let's be honest, guys, Zhang Xin's outro is one of the most applicable in the game, because a Resonance Liberation damage boost can apply to like most teams, right? There are less teams that it doesn't apply to than teams that it does. I think she's slept on in a lot of ways, just simply due to the fact that people don't like standing still in a game like this, and I can respect that. Her playstyle is not for everybody, but her buffs are. All right, next up, Danjin is a bit of an interesting character. I think that she is, to a degree, very, very interesting to play, but I think she might be at the bottom of A when it comes to being an actual sub-DPS character. Because she focuses a lot more on personal damage, but has the trade-off of her personal damage is kind of shit unless you spend a lot of field time on her. And the end result is that when you focus more on using her as a buffer, you're not going to get great results. But if you're leaning more into her being like a dual DPS, she gets better results. But she doesn't have a lot of dual DPS partners because Camellia is a greedy woman. And Havoc Rover kind of just doesn't have like the same level of pop due to the fact that Havoc Rover also wants field time. But like, I do believe that her gameplay as a sub DPS is worse than these three characters. So we can definitely pump her down here to like B, but this is what my A tier is, or we'll put Tauchi in B here. Maybe like somewhere around here. I think she's better as a sustainer. We'll just put Tauchi down here and then make like this sort of situation right now. All right, S is pretty easy. And there's going to be a lot of characters in S tier. Those are my rankings for S tier. Now, you guys might be a little bit confused, right? The reason why I'm putting Mortefi below and above Chang Li is pretty much due to the fact that this guy does a lot of damage. And Chang Li, I'm rating her lower, but because Chang Li is hard as shit to play. So bottom of S is where it is for me, just to recognize her potential. But the fact that she's so goddamn hard to play is why I can just never justify her being that high. And yeah, her buffs only last 10 seconds. It's intentionally designed to be shorter than other characters. It's a big downside. That is 14 seconds to 10 seconds is a massive percentage decrease. A lot of learning curve to playing this character. And guess what, guys? Remember that thing I talked about where investment matters? You can use a really bad Moonlit Clouds on these four characters, right? And then you put that on Chang Li. Your Chang Li team is going to be like 30 times worse than the other team. Now, Sanhua, she does not do as much damage as those other characters relative to the rest of their teams. Jeja and Yinlin, for example, they have better buffs than Sanhua. So let's go and talk a little bit about why Sanhua's buffs are objectively worse in general than those from Yinlin and Jeja. It's actually pretty simple.
Like this?
This number is 38. This number is 20 plus 25. 45 is bigger than 38. If you're going into this comparison, being like, Jeja is worse than Sanhua because she doesn't buff Camellia as much, and that's why she's a higher tier, we're just talking about it in terms of how these characters are performing, right? On the teams that they work in. And so trying to make that comparison to push one character over the other is one of the most nonsensical things you can do. There's no reason for it. All right, how is that list looking, everybody? Bottom of S for Chang Li, mainly due to the difficulty. All right, perfect. Okay, so the long-awaited DPS category. The long-awaited DPS category. And this right here, let me just say firsthand that these two, Jeja and Yinlin, they are not going to be on this tier list. Because one of the big strengths about these two characters, Jeja and Yinlin, is the fact that they will continue dealing damage when you aren't using them. That is like a cornerstone of somebody that shouldn't be a main DPS. Because if they're able to do damage while not on fielding, why would you make them on field? And specifically Yinlin, especially with Stringmaster, who gets better buffs when she isn't on field, it's actually griefing her damage potential for her to be on field. I'll put them on the list for where they actually belong based off of my performance with them. You guys get what I'm talking about there, right? It's just these characters were not made for on-fielding. You can do it. You can do it for fun, right? You can put Yinlin on Void Thunder, and, you know, I will think less of you for it, but you can do it. Let's get on with the actual people on this tier list. So, this will probably be an easier list to go from the bottom up. I'm going to put main DPS Alto in B. This character right now is a little bit interesting from the perspective that he's good in single target, but this is one of the most horrifically bad characters I have ever seen in AoE. I do believe that his complete lack of ability to deal with anything AoE content-wise is one of the worst things about him. Similarly, kind of want to put Chisha in B, because unless you're able to like one-shot the ads with Chisha's ultimate or Chisha's liberation, oh, if you're playing this character in AoE, oh, that's not good either. But in single target, Chisha gets the job done. Chisha can 3-star solo TOA in single target, right? But another thing is that Chisha's rotations feel so odd, and her interaction with teammates is like strange to a degree. Because she's a little bit like Danjin in that she benefits very heavily from uninterrupted field time, but your teammates have to do things on the battlefield. And it's like, it just feels odd matching up her timings with that of her teammates. And that's kind of the same thing with Danjin. That's why I kind of want to put her into like bottom of A or maybe with Chisha in B, because Danjin feels really weird to play in a team. Danjin doesn't feel that good to use in a team. The main problem with it is simply due to the fact that like you want these fully charged Chaos Cleaves on this character to deal any damage at all. If you don't get them, the damage is so absurdly bad that it isn't good. And it's like, her having teammates is almost a detractor from her performance. These two characters, in a sense, almost go against the logic of the game itself, if I'm frankly being honest. Like, these two are like A or potentially S if they have no teammates. But like in a full 3-person team, gosh, they feel kind of shitty to use. You guys gotta realize that when you're in a 3-person team with a sub-DPS buff on you, you now have a timer on how you're playing on field before those buffs expire. And these characters, with how they play, very heavily reliant on dodge counters and the bonuses they get from doing them, the time limit doesn't feel great. I think these two could have been potentially controversial, but hopefully you understand my reasoning. Now, let's move on to the A tier. First things first, Havoc Rover. And you guys might be a little bit surprised by me, but I'm also putting Calcharo in A. I know. I shit talk him all the time. But the fact of the matter is that if you're willing to learn a couple of cancels on him, you can do pretty damn good damage. That doesn't negate the fact that he's probably one of, if not the hardest characters to play in the game. And that is why he's going in the bottom of A for me. His barrier to entry is really high, but as you guys will see from the short CN preview that I have, he does have some of the best damage in the game. He has some of the highest damage potential in the game, but it is so hard to access it, and you can get to like 95% of it by learning a couple of small things. And guys, there could be an Electro version of Alto that does like some weird taunty shit, right? That turns the bosses back to Calcharo, and now playing him doesn't feel like, you know, you're actually like a masochist or something. So he's waiting for more help, but he can be played very well right now, right? And he has potential. But the problem
Easy
is,
money.
it's really hard for anybody to reach it. How is that? Have we avoided the last landmine, everybody? I think the rest of this tier list is going to be pretty smooth from here on out. Oh, and Ling Yang goes in B. You guys can imagine where this tier list is going next, right? Jinxie is S tier. Jinxie is the top of S tier for a few simple reasons. She basically, Jinxie's like skill curve, like skill or like input to output ratio. Like, let's just say the input is like how much time a person is putting into learning the character, learning their ins and outs, learning how to play their teams, blah, blah, blah. The character plays itself to the point where even the lowest skilled person is just already benefiting from the fact that she does attacks in the air and has hyper armor built into her attacks in the air. This character, when you start playing her to when you like become the best Jinxie player on the planet, her performance doesn't really change. Her performance only changes when you get to the point where you can use 2 resonant skills in one rotation and you one-shot the boss. That is what CN does in their speedruns. That is the only kind of market improvement you can make in her rotations. So, again, for these DPS rankings, these characters are going to be at like E0, S1, because the idea is that there are some characters or some weapon types like Broadblades where if you don't have the signature, it's kind of bad, right? Like Jinxie on like the standard Broadblade, okay guys, it's kind of bad. Gion on the standard Broadblade, it's kind of bad. Next up, we're going to have Camellia, right? Just from the perspective of, okay, this character has an easy mode. And then this character also has like a hard mode in that you can hyper optimize this character's rotations in single target, and you can kind of do some juicy stuff with her in multi-target, right? By switching in and out of her skill mode and alternating your rotations because of it. There are a lot of cases, right, where these two people are going to switch spots depending on what the content is, what the boss is, and, you know, who you're fighting in these situations. I would say that they're basically, you can just flip-flop between the two. I would never consider one stronger than the other. I would first take a look at what content you're trying to tackle, and then just go in between the two, right? Depending on who's better. They are, if you're saying one is objectively stronger than the other, you are wrong. It is too hard to make that distinction. But if we are talking about it in terms of average power level, right? That people are going to be able to access across gameplay, Jinxie is on average going to be higher. Because even if you're spamming Camellia's Blossom mode and that's the only way you're dealing damage, that's still harder to play than Jinxie. Because Camellia's stationary, Jinxie can move. Jinxie moves automatically in her rotations even. And then Camellia has to dodge, right? She can end up having to chase mobile bosses, right? And then, you know, noobs will forget to cancel her Blossom mode and go chase them on the ground. And then they'll start like spam dodging to like get to the boss. And it's a disaster, right? If we're talking about value in a character and value in terms of who you feel comfortable bringing to different game modes, then from that perspective, Camellia is better, right? If somebody were to ask me who is the best 5-star limited character and like signature weapon in the game, I would tell them Camellia. Because they can use Camellia in single target, they can use her in AoE, and they can use her in multi-wave. And that brings me into this guy. This is where we're going to start turning the tier list in S into, let's just hypothetically call it, right, a value tier list, right? Jinxie's at the bottom of S for me on a value tier list. And I think Encore below her. Let's just say that these characters cost X amount of money or X amount of pulls. If I'm trying to think about the value of a DPS, I am putting Jinxie at the bottom. Because all 4 of these characters work better in AoE or multi-wave content than her. And all 4 of these characters can clear the tower. Jinxie and Encore are the only characters in S right now that cannot be played in other game modes. Guys, remember, I put the word value here. In terms of, if I'm pulling this character, right? If I'm pulling Jinxie, and there is a game mode where I cannot use her in, to me, she is less valuable than a DPS character that is usable in all the game modes. Is it not true that Jinxie will perform worse than the 4 characters in front of her in Pincer Maneuver Warriors? Like, to the point where you're just, like, disgusted at the idea of playing her. Why is Jinxie the only one, even if she's the best character in the game, why is she the only one that can't really play that game mode when these three characters can? That's crazy. Guys, that's crazy. Remember, we're talking about the value per pull. These three characters, I guess you could kind of alternate between these two because Chong-Li does need another limited to really feel good. I guess we could maybe like alternate the rankings like this. Guys, these three characters, if you're looking at value, they are better than Jinxie. So, let me bring this up here, right? Guys, let me just zoom in on the relevant part, right? In the tower, right? You can do a 2-minute clear, and then there are people that are clearing it in 30 to 45 seconds. Jinxie might be the person that gets you to the 1 minute or the 30 to 45. If you're using any of the 3 DPSs in front of her on the value tier list, you will clear, if they're built in any capacity whatsoever, they will clear the TOA within 2 minutes. And so, because of the fact that Jinxie is like frighteningly bad in some types of content, that means she is a lower value per pull, because the other characters can be used in all the content, and she can't. So if they all cost the same, and one can be used in less places, that means they are less valuable. Alright, so, do we understand the value part of the tier list? Do we understand why I made the value tier list? So now what we're going to do is we're going to do the dual DPS tier list. Do we understand this, everybody? Do we understand the dual DPS tier list? The main reason, so basically, let's go through some of these rankings. I have Zhang Liao as the best dual DPS in the game, is because you can quite literally do his entire hypercarry rotation and not lose very much efficiency at all, if any efficiency, if you're able to go ahead and do the timings right. He basically has, in dual DPS, it's just an extension of his regular gameplay. It is one of the easiest dual DPS characters to learn, and there are so many different teams you can run with him. Chang-Li is a character, right, where you need somebody to swap to in order to function in the first place. If you don't have anybody to cancel Chang-Li with, she's not a very good playstyle experience. Versus Zhang Liao, if you don't have anybody to cancel with in the first place, he still works. So to me, the only reason why I have him ranked above Chang-Li is simply due to the fact that he has incredible dual DPS capability, but still has his baseline kit, while Chang-Li really only has her dual DPS ability. Encore is in S tier, in dual DPS at the very end, because I can see in some ways how her combo is a little bit harder to learn than some other characters. Because she has some very strict timings, especially on her double resonance skill cast in her baseline form, right? You can cast it, start shooting the little stuff, and then you have to swap to another character, do something really fast, and then swap back to her to land the final resonance skill shot. It is very hard to do that in actual gameplay and actually make it a DPS increase in her teams. But if you're able to leverage all of her combos, you can get a lot out of it. But if we're frankly being honest and then judging things by difficulty in dual DPS, this is probably a more accurate tier list. If we're thinking about dual DPS in terms of like actually factoring in difficulty, Chang-Li, even if you mess up some of her stuff in dual DPS, it's not that bad, right? Because you're just going to swap anyways, and then it's not like a huge deal. On Encore, if you're like messing the stuff up, it's like, why are you even playing Encore in dual DPS in the first place? If you're just missing all the timings, then it's like hypercarry was the way to go. Chang-Li, on the other hand, it's like you weren't playing her on any other team anyways. The last two categories, it could get a little bit tricky, and that's due to the fact that Havoc Rover, in my opinion, is good in dual DPS, right? But they kind of have some really, really weird timings, especially as they get more of their sequence nodes. They get a lot of buffs when they're in their Forte mode enhanced state, and sometimes you just like don't have it. And you can miss a lot of your buffs on Havoc Rover by simply not being in like the Dark Surge state before using some of your damage. So that's why Havoc Rover is in B for me, because they're actually a lot trickier and requires a lot more micromanagement on their Forte circuit in ways that like even these two characters don't have to deal with. That's just from my personal opinion, you could easily bump Havoc Rover up to A if you'd like. And Chongli, if you discount Dan Jin, she can be used with all of these characters on the roster, or all of the characters that we're seeing here. This might be a better ranking, just to like emphasize the potential. Calcharo, on the other hand, Calcharo's going into B just because of the sheer fact that, I'm gonna be honest guys, he's really hard to play. He's really hard to play to the point where he's noticeably harder than these 4 characters. I feel like Calcharo's skill levels, like skill drop off here in dual DPS is so significant, especially with all of these other characters that you have available. And Dan Jin, I kind of put her on here just cuz, but it's really similar to the whole Havoc Rover, or to the whole Sub-DPS situation we were talking about. Dan Jin commands so much field time in dual DPS that you might as well not even be playing dual DPS anymore. Again, if you're not building up a full Forte circuit with this character, you are doing no damage to the boss. Or no damage to any enemy, frankly. Alright. And so, guys, I've got something really cool that I want to show you, but I gotta make sure I can find it. Alright. Now, the last thing that I want to do is, I'm not gonna make like the full tier list of it, but if you all are interested, I have the tier list for speedrun content. The tier list for speedrun content in CN. This is the part of the player base that essentially goes ahead. This is the speedrun tier list. So, Jinxie enjoyers. Remember how I talked about how she's really good at single target? This is how good she is in single target. She is quite literally, for speedruns, better than every character in the game. This is not S6R5, this is S0S1. S0S1, this is the speedrun tier list. You'll notice it's a little weird, right? Yinlin's down here. That's because Yinlin deals damage over time with her coordinated attacks, and speedruns end too fast for her to even do her full Forte circuit's damage. Once bosses get more HP, Yinlin becomes better in speedruns. And Calcharo has so many optimizations when played in the sweatiest way. He does like his 4 Death Messenger combos. They are one of the strongest things in speedruns if you're doing the 4 DM combos. This is what I mean, guys, by certain contents rewarding certain things, right? And different things warranting different tier lists. The fact of the matter is that Jinxie is unmatched in speedruns. Oh boy, you guys want to see some? All right, I've got some pretty disgusting stuff ready for you guys. You guys are going to be in for a nasty one, okay? Are you guys ready? Are you guys ready to see a Calcharo speedrun? Can you guys do this? Can you guys play like this? Do you guys see why this is a different tier list? They're using Thundering Methods, by the way. Look at that Calcharo backstepping. What am I watching? Did you guys like that? Did you guys like that? So, anyone wondering why Calcharo's there? Are we good with Calcharo's placement? And I've got another cool video for you guys. It's a little disgusting. Put that shit down. This is their quick swap team, or this is their double DPS Gion team. With Encore. Why is this quality so ass? Do you see this? It's crazy. That's just a short preview of all of the different things that are possible with these characters when you're like attempting speedrun content. And what you can see is that it's just a completely different game. They are playing a different game than we are when they do stuff like that. And that's why different tier lists are necessary. There's a reason why these characters are all the way at the bottom over here. Hopefully that little overview on all of the potential prospective tier lists that I've been thinking about when it comes to this game, hopefully that made some sense. I think the really important thing about it, right, especially when it comes to Wuthering Waves, is having either a tier list that's going to incorporate all of the different content in the game, you know, stuff like pincer maneuver warriors, right? And stop focusing so much on single target, right? Multi-wave AoE is a huge thing, right? The pincer maneuver warriors event is one of the hardest we've ever had. And I just think having a more holistic view on these rankings, really, you know, thinking about what it's looking like on the higher end and the lower end, and then trying to go for something where it's achievable for players, but also like not lean in too much into like downplaying how hard certain characters are, like Chang Li. And you know, I think with that, just like some closing notes in regards to like Prydwen and their tier list, what you'll find is that I agree with about 90% of the stuff on it. And the big areas where I'm disagreeing is where I think either the builds are outdated or certain factors about their gameplay are being understated. But when it comes to stuff like Jinxie, Havoc Rover, Chang Li, or like, you know, Chang Li's damage, that sort of stuff, like Jinxie, Havoc Rover, Jian, I understand the placements, right? And there's a reason why I made sure to separately point out those value tier lists. So hopefully all those different classifications are good enough for you guys to get some value out of it. And with that, have a good one. Peace out.